Book of Dust, Tale 1, The Road to Bakti. Chapter 3. The Forest and the Deep Earth. The forest of Bakti did not begin all at once. It gathered. First there came scattered trees along the road, old trunks rising from the steppe like watchers posted at the edge of another dominion. Then the undergrowth thickened, and the earth changed beneath hoof and wheel. Dust gave way to dark loam. The dry wind that had ridden with them across the Badlands fell away, and in its place came a breath colder and wetter, carrying the scents of moss, leaf rot, running water, and the hidden life of roots sunk deep in ancient ground. Before long the sky itself was taken from them. Branches crossed overhead in a blackening mesh, vast and patient, so that what light remained came down in greenish shafts, narrow and sickle-thin, striking here a stone, there a fern, and dying at once upon the forest floor. Vines hung in loops from the higher limbs. Great roots, knotted as the limbs of giants, humped through the soil and vanished again. Moss sheathed fallen logs like funeral cloth. Somewhere unseen, water ran over stone with a ceaseless voice, and the sound of it lent the silence not peace but depth. The men of Meduli spoke of Bakti as though it were merely a town at the end of a road. Those who had gone farther spoke otherwise. They said the forest was older than the city, and would remain when its walls were dust. They said forgotten peoples had once built under its shadow, and made offerings to nameless things in clearings where no bird sang. They said the ground concealed old barrows and older ruins, and that when storms broke, the roots sometimes dragged up worked stones from the black soil, lintels carved with symbols no living priest could read, idols with their faces worn smooth, blades turned green with age in hands long since become earth. Arven had heard all such tales in ports and stables and over wine-dark tables, where men embroidered danger to magnify their own courage. He had believed little of it. Yet, as the wagon rolled deeper beneath that dim vault, he understood why even liars spoke softly of Bakti. The forest did not seem hostile. That would have been easier. It seemed instead wholly unconcerned with men, as the sea was unconcerned, or the desert. It allowed them passage not from mercy, but because their lives signified nothing to it. The stream they found ran clear and swift over a bed of stone, narrow enough to cross on horseback, broad enough to water the beasts, and wash blood from cloth and skin. It came twisting down between alder and dark pine, its banks feathered with rushes and fern. The travellers drew up there at the thyrsus' command without protest, for all of them had begun to feel the weight of the day in bone and sinew. The horses lowered their heads greedily to drink. Terrin, pale with blood loss and weariness, let Halvek ease him from the wagon and seat him upon a flat stone near the bank. Arven moved among the crates, checking lashings and wheel pincer by habit more than necessity. The thyrsa said little. He soared to his horse, then stood a short distance from the stream, with his back to an oak thick enough to stop an arrow, gazing into the trees, as if listening to a counsel that none of the others could hear. In the fading light, Arven studied him more carefully than before. The man was not merely large, though he was that in a way that made ordinary men seem meagre beside him. He bore himself with that savage economy which belongs only to predators and veteran soldiers. No movement wasted, no gesture idly made. His dark hair, heavy and coarse, was bound back from a brow marked by old scars. The shoulders beneath his weathered leathers were as broad as a gate beam, and one of his hands, resting near the pommel at his hip, seemed big enough to close over a lesser man's throat. Yet it was not his size that held the eye longest. It was the face. There was something inhuman in it at first glance. The planes too hard, the cheekbones too pronounced, the jaw too sternly cut, as though a war god had shaped him with a chisel instead of flesh. But the longer Arven looked, the less monstrous he seemed, and the more dangerous. A scar crossed one temple and vanished into the hairline. Another, faint and pale, tugged at the corner of his mouth without quite becoming a sneer. And his eyes, they were dark red, though in the uncertain light beneath the boughs there were moments when they deepened toward brown. And in those moments a man might glimpse not the brute, the cities named him, but the human thing buried under old blood and older hatreds. Helvek followed Arven's gaze and grunted. "Never shared a fire with one of his kind before," the god muttered. "Nor I," Arven said. Terran, who was trying and failing to tie fresh linen one-handed about his shoulder, gave a wan smile. "Then perhaps this road means to educate us." The Thursar's head turned slightly. Whether he had heard or merely sensed their regard, none could tell. Arven crossed the space between them with a cup in one hand and a strip of dried meat in the other. "You've earned both," he said. The Thursar looked at the offerings, then accepted them with a nod that was neither humble nor proud. "We have ridden half a day beside one another," Arven went on. "It seems a poor custom to keep calling a man by his race." The Thursar drank, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and regarded Arven over the rim. "Skorun," he said at last. The name suited him. It came down like a stone dropped in a well. "Tavern keepers do not often survive long enough to learn such names," Helvek remarked. At that, something dry moved at the corner of Skorun's mouth. "Most don't ask." Terran laughed, then winced and clutched at his bandage. Arven settled on a root opposite him. "I am Arven Sorel. That is Helvek. The lad you helped keep among the living is Terran." Skorun inclined his head once to each name, as if storing them where he kept roads and grudges. "You've travelled this way often?" Arven asked. "Often enough." "Then tell me whether the tales about Bakti grow out of the ground as thick as these trees." "They grow from graves," Skorun said. No man spoke for a moment after that. The sun fell lower. What little gold there had been among the branches faded into pewter and then into shadow. Helvek kindled a small fire beneath a shelf of stone, where its glow would not carry far. They ate without ceremony, dried meat, hard bread softened in water, a little cheese gone oily in the heat of the day. Arven uncorked a skin of ale from the wagon and passed it around. Even Terran took a mouthful, though Helvek objected that it would thin his blood. "Then perhaps it will make the rest of me lighter," the youth said, and for the first time since the road attack there was something almost boyish in him again. The forest changed as night advanced. By full dark the stream no longer sang but whispered, its voice muffled by the weight of shadow. The leaves overhead ceased their faint daylight stirring and hung still, black against black. Somewhere far off an owl cried once, and once only. After that there was no bird call at all. The firelight did not so much drive back the gloom as stain it red for a few feet around the camp. Beyond that little circle the woods stood waiting, rank upon rank of trunks, with hollows between them where anything might have crouched unseen. Arven lay rolled in his cloak with one hand near his knife. Terran slept fitfully beside the wagon, feverish from pain and weariness. Helvek took first watch, seated on a log with spear across his knees. Skorun stood for a long time apart from the others, head lifted slightly as if scenting weather. At length he came back to the fire, sat cross-legged upon the earth, and closed his eyes. Yet there was nothing of sleep in him. When the attack came, it came without warning. A hiss split the dark. Helvek jerked and uttered a sound that was half cough, half curse. An arrow had buried itself through the leather of his upper arm. Before the cry had fully left his throat, Another shaft struck the wagon with a hard thunk, and the horses screamed and reared against their tethers. "Up!" Scoran roared, and there was more command in that single word than in a captain's whole speech. Figures burst from the trees. They were not soldiers, and they were not common thieves. They came half naked save for hides and bits of scavenged armor, their faces streaked with ash and ochre, their hair knotted with bone and feather. Some bore axes of poor iron, some broad knives, one a hooked spear. They moved with the rush and shrill ferocity of hunting men, uttering cries that seemed less speech than the barking of beasts. Forest brigands, wild men of the outer woods, the sort of carrion feeders that gathered where law thinned. Halvek was on his feet before the second arrow flew. He tore the shaft from his arm and met the first attacker with a spear thrust that punched through ribs and sent the raider crashing backward into the fire. Sparks leapt. The man screamed once as embers took his hair. Arven came up with his curved merchant's sword in hand, the blade made more for close work in alleys and ship decks than battlefields. But he used it as a man uses any tool when death is at hand. A woodsman sprang at him from the left. Arven sidestepped, caught the descending axe on the fort of his blade, and drove his knife into the man's throat under the jaw. Blood poured black in the firelight, and the body fell clawing at the wound. Terran, half stunned from sleep, managed to drag himself behind the wagon, even as a raider vaulted the sideboard to get at the crates. The youth seized a hand-axe from among the gear and buried it in the bandit's shin. The man howled and pitched sideways, and Terran, white-faced and shaking, hacked at him again and again until Halvek shoved the corpse off him with his boot. Then Scoran entered the fray entire. There was nothing graceful in him. Grace belongs to dancers and duelists. He fought like a landslide. His sword, a broad, workman-like thing hacked and repolished 100 times, took a man across the collar and nearly severed the arm. He backhanded another raider with such force that teeth flew shining into the fire. A spear thrust slid across his side and tore leather, but before the wielder could recover, Scoran had seized the shaft, yanked the man off balance, and split his skull to the nose. He gave no battle cry. His breath came through clenched teeth, and every blow landed with the dreadful certainty of habit. More shapes moved among the trees. Too many. Arven saw it in a blink between swings, shadows pacing the camp's edge, more than their little fire circle could answer. Some had bows. One flame-tipped arrow struck a bundle beneath the wagon and was stamped out only by chance. Another horse broke its tether and plunged into the dark, dragging rope. "We can't hold here," Arven shouted. Scoran had already seen it. "Take the stream bank," he bellowed. "Move!" Halvek seized Terran by the collar and half dragged him towards the water. Arven snatched what he could, waterskin, satchel, torch, and followed as the three burst through a screen of ferns, with Scoran at their rear. The brigands came after them in yelling pursuit, crashing through the undergrowth, arrows whistling overhead. The stream curved hard along a bank of black rock veiled in hanging roots. In daylight, the descent might have been seen for what it was, the lip of an old collapse, narrow and treacherous, where earth and stone had broken away into some forgotten hollow below. At night they discovered it with their bodies. The ground vanished under Halvek's boots. He managed one rough cry and flung Terran ahead of him. Then the bank gave way in a rush of soil, roots, stones, and men, and all of them plunged into blackness. Arven struck something hard enough to drive the breath from him. The torch flew from his hand in a wheel of sparks and went out. He slid through loose earth and broken rock, tumbled over a ledge, and came to rest in cold mud with the taste of blood and dirt in his mouth. For a while there was only ringing silence. Then the cavern made itself known. Water dripped from unseen heights with a slow cathedral rhythm. Somewhere nearby, the stream they had followed above ground poured through stone in a louder rush, feeding a hidden channel whose breath came cool and mineral-rich through the dark. Faint glimmers emerged little by little as Arven's stunned eyes adjusted. A wan ghost light reflected from pale fungus clinging to boulders. Patches of moss that shone faintly green where water touched them. The white trunks of strange root-fed growths that rose out of the cavern floor like the boles of dead trees. Great curtains of stone hung from the roof above in jagged folds. Columns, built drop by drop over ages no man could measure, climbed from floor to ceiling. Between them spread a wilderness under the earth, thickets of broad blind leaves, mats of pallid creepers, pools black as polished obsidian, and winding game trails pressed through fern and fungus by things that had never seen the sun. It was as though some drowned garden from elder days had been hidden below the world and left to moulder in secrecy. Terran groaned nearby. Halvek answered him hoarsely. Arven pushed himself up on one knee, every bone afire. On a rise of broken stone a few paces away, Scoran stood already upright, blood running from a cut at his temple, sword in hand, listening into the dark. Then sound came from above. Loose gravel rattled down. Voices, thin and savage, echoed from the collapsed mouth overhead. The brigands had found the break in the bank. "By all black gods," Halvek muttered, "they're coming after." "One trouble at a time," Scoran said. He crossed to Terran, hauled the youth to his feet with one hand, and shoved him toward Arven. "Can you walk?" Terran swallowed, nodded, nearly fell, then found his feet again. More stones pattered down. A face appeared briefly at the lip of the break above, only a darker blot against darkness, then vanished. A torch arced through the opening, struck a ledge, and sputtered fitfully among damp stones. Its glow lit the cavern in feverish flashes. What it showed was enough. The brigands descended by roots and jutting stone in twos and threes, slipping, snarling, eager for cornered prey. The torchlight leapt over the white growths and black pools and made monstrous shadows of every pillar. Halvek bared his teeth. So be it. But before either side could close, another sound rose from the deeps. It began as a thin keening, so high and remote that Arven thought at first it came from the stone itself. Then it swelled into a shriek that seemed to flay the air. It was not the cry of any wolf or cat or bird. It was the scream of something born in a night older than human fear. The sound struck the cavern walls and came back in splintered echoes until a man could not tell from what quarter it approached. The leading brigand froze upon a ledge, eyes rolling wide. From behind a pillar of stone something pale unfolded. It moved with a hideous, sinuous spring. Tall as a man and longer, all white hide stretched tight over gaunt, powerful limbs. It had no wings, yet there was something of the bat in its skull and shoulders, an obscene, cave-bred parody of flying things. The head was narrow and blunt, the mouth too wide, crowded with needle teeth. Its forelimbs were long enough to brush the stone as it ran, ending in hooked claws fit to cling or rend. Folds of skin hung in places along its ribs and arms like shriveled remnants of pinions denied. Its eyes were milk-pale and depthless. When it opened its jaws, the shriek came again, and the brigand nearest it spasmed, as though the cry itself had entered his flesh. Then the thing struck. It hit him high, bore him from the ledge, and both vanished into the white tangle below. The man screamed once, briefly. The sound broke wetly and ceased. A second brigand thrust downward with his spear in panic. The pale creature reared up from the fernbed, all blood-splashed ivory and snarling jaws, and tore his face away with one rake of its claws. "Back," Scoran said, and there was iron in his voice now. Not fear, but the cold recognition of a foe not met by standing still. The raiders above had lost all taste for pursuit. Some scrambled upward at once. One fell in his haste and broke against a stone with a crunch Arven felt in his own spine. Another bolted into the lower growth, thinking perhaps to outflank the creature, and vanished between two fungus-white trunks. A heartbeat later, there came a choking cry, then silence. The cavern had changed hands. Skorun seized the half-burned torch from where it guttered on the rock and lifted it high. This way. He did not wait to see if they obeyed. Arven shoved Thorne ahead of him. Helvek brought up the rear, spear lowered, glancing constantly back toward the shrieks and crashing foliage behind them. They plunged into the underworld thicket, following narrow paths where the ground was firmer. The torchlight showed glimpses only, roots as thick as a man's waist descending from cracks in the roof. Pale, moth-like vermin fluttering blind through the heat, stagnant pools whose skins rippled as unseen things slipped beneath. Behind them the shrieking came and went. Sometimes there were human cries with it, sometimes not. They had gone perhaps 100 paces when Helvek hissed sharply and shoved Thorne forward with a violence born of love rather than anger. The pale thing dropped from above. It had clung to a slant of stone overhanging the path, silent as lichen, and now it fell among them in a blur of claws and white hide. Helvek met it with a spear. The point drove into its chest, but not deep enough. The shaft bent like green wood. The creature screamed in his face, and blood sprayed from its mouth over his beard and mail. "Run!" Helvek roared. It was not the cry of a man begging fate. It was an order. He jammed the splintering spear crosswise into the monster's jaws and threw all his weight against it, grappling it back step by brutal step as its claws opened his arms and breast. Arven caught one last image of him in the swinging torchlight. Broad feet planted in black mud, teeth bared under a mask of blood, straining like some old gate guardian against the horror of the deep, while Thorne, wild-eyed and stumbling, was driven clear of the path by that sacrifice. Then Skorun dragged them on. Arven heard Helvek once more, not screaming, cursing. Then the curse broke into a raw, hoarse shout, and after that there was only the shriek of the creature and the thrashing of ruined growth. Thorne made as if to turn back. Arven seized him and struck him hard across the face. "He bought you steps," Arven snarled. "Don't waste them." The youth sagged, sobered by grief more than pain, and let himself be hauled to Awad. Ahead, the dark seemed endless. Behind, something fed, and under the earth of Bakti, where no dawn could find them, the hunt had only begun. Thus, the torchlight of the survivors passed deeper beneath the earth, into those black kingdoms where no sun had ever shone, and no mercy had ever entered. Behind them, somewhere amid the blind forests and stone rivers of the abyss, Helvek still fought his last battle against the pale horror of the deep. Whether any prayer reached him there, none could say. For beneath the forests of Bakti, the world had grown older, and the dark had only begun to wake.